Barrett Coltrane built his fortune on Texas soil, but success came with a price, a heart sealed tighter than his bank vault. At 62, the wealthy rancher lives alone in his sprawling ranch house, convinced that family brings nothing but heartache and loss. His days follow the same routine, checking cattle, counting profits, and sleeping in silence. But one scorching afternoon changes everything when he discovers a young woman collapsed at his gate, barely alive from hunger and exhaustion. Elena Cruz, 21 and desperate, has fled debts that could destroy her. Bear intends to give her one meal and send her away, but something about her grateful smile and gentle way with his horses makes him hesitate. What happens when a man who's sworn off love meets someone who reminds him what he's been missing all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Texas hill country in shades of gold and amber, stretching across 15,000 acres of prime grazing land that Barrett Coltrane had called home for more than 40 years. From the wraparound porch of his limestone ranch house, he could see cattle dotting the pastures like dark brushstrokes on a canvas of green. The sight should have filled him with satisfaction. It represented everything he'd worked for, fought for, and earned through decades of careful planning and relentless determination. Instead, it reminded him of how quiet the world had become, bare, as everyone had called him since his football days at Texas A&M. Stood 6'4" in his worn leather boots, his broad shoulders still carrying the strength of a man who'd spent his life wrestling steers and mending fences. Silver threads had long since overtaken the black in his hair, and deep lines mapped the territory around his pale blue eyes, each one a testament to years spent squinting against the sun and wind. At 62, he moved with the deliberate grace of someone who'd learned to conserve energy for what mattered most. What mattered most these days was the ranch, the cattle, the land that would outlive him just as it had outlived his father and grandfather before him. Inside the house, the grandfather clock in the hallway marked 7:30 with its steady chime. Bear had grown accustomed to its voice, the only reliable conversation partner he had left. The sound echoed through rooms that once buzzed with activity, but now stood as monuments to a different time. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, above the stone fireplace, their subjects frozen in moments of joy that felt like artifacts from someone else's life. His coffee had grown cold in the heavy ceramic mug, but Bear barely noticed as he reviewed the ledger spread across the kitchen table. Numbers didn't lie or leave or break your heart when you needed them most. They simply were reliable, predictable, safe. The ranch's accounts showed healthy profits from the spring cattle sales, and the summer hay crop promised to be one of the best in recent memory. By any measure, Barrett Coltrane was a successful man. Success, however, made poor company at breakfast. The kitchen itself told the story of a life that had gradually contracted around one person's needs. Where once a large family table had hosted Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings, now a smaller table sat positioned to catch the morning light. The countertops, once cluttered with the organized chaos of family life, now held only the essentials: coffee maker, toaster, and a few well-worn cookbooks that rarely saw use anymore. Bear's daily routine had crystallized over the years into a pattern as predictable as the seasons. Morning coffee and account reviews gave way to a thorough check of the cattle, followed by maintenance work that never seemed to end on a spread this size. His ranch hands Tommy Valdez and old Pete Morrison handled most of the heavy lifting these days, but Bear still insisted on knowing every detail of his operation. Control was something he understood, something he could manage without risk of disappointment. The sound of tires on gravel announced Tommy's arrival for the morning briefing. Through the kitchen window, Bear watched the younger man climb out of his battered pickup truck, adjusting his hat against the already building heat. Tommy had worked the Coltrane Ranch for 12 years. starting as a teenager and growing into the most reliable hand Bear had ever employed. More than that, Tommy had become something approaching a friend, though Bear was careful not to let the relationship venture too far into personal territory. "Morning, boss," Tommy called as he climbed the porch steps, his boots announcing each footfall on the weathered boards. "Coffee's fresh," Bear replied, his standard greeting that served as both welcome and distance keeper. "What's the word from the south pasture?" Tommy helped himself to a mug from the cabinet, a privilege earned through years of trust, and settled into the chair across from Bear. "Fence looks good after yesterday's repair work. Found a few strays near Miller's Creek, but nothing serious. That new bull's been keeping the herd settled." Bear nodded, making notes in the margin of his ledger. "Water levels? Holding steady. Pete thinks we might need to check the windmill bearings next week, but it's still pumping strong." These conversations had become a cornerstone of Bear's day practical, focused discussions about concrete problems with measurable solutions. No emotional complications, no unexpected revelations, no risk of loss beyond the occasional sick animal or broken equipment. The ranch provided structure in a life that had lost its other anchors. "I'll be riding the fence line today," Bear announced, closing the ledger with a decisive snap. "Need to check the north gate and see how the summer grass is coming in." Tommy nodded, understanding that these solo rides served purposes beyond ranch management. Everyone who worked for Barrett Coltrane had learned to recognize his need for space, for the solitude that seemed to recharge something essential in him. They respected it because they respected him, and because he paid them well enough to afford patience with their employer's quirks. After Tommy left to begin his own day's work, Bear saddled Ranger, the bay gelding who'd been his companion for 8 years. The horse knew the routine, as well as his rider a leisurely circuit of the property boundaries, checking for problems, while allowing Bear's mind to wander across familiar territory. These rides had become a form of meditation, a way of processing thoughts that seemed too large for the confines of the house. The morning air carried the scent of sage and mesquite, punctuated by the distant lowing of cattle and the harsh cry of a red-shouldered hawk circling overhead. This was the Texas that Bear had fallen in love with as a young man, the landscape that had shaped his understanding of what mattered and what endured. Land didn't promise what it couldn't deliver. Animals didn't pretend to be something they weren't. The weather might be unpredictable, but it wasn't personal. People, on the other hand, were another matter entirely. Bear's first marriage had ended when he was 35. A casualty of his inability to balance the demands of building a ranch empire with the needs of a relationship. Sarah had been a good woman, too good for the half-attention of a man obsessed with proving himself in a business that demanded everything. She'd left for Houston, and a man who could promise her more than weekend conversations about cattle prices and fence repairs. His second attempt at companionship had lasted longer, but ended more painfully. Margaret had understood ranch life, had even seemed to thrive in it for a while. But when the miscarriages started 3 lost pregnancies in 2 years, the dream of family they'd built together crumbled under the weight of shared grief and unspoken blame. She'd moved back to her sister's place in Austin, and Bear had thrown himself into ranch work with the desperate intensity of a man trying to outrun his own shadow. That was 15 years ago. Since then, Bear had built walls as solid as the limestone foundation of his house, barriers designed to keep out anything that might threaten the careful equilibrium he'd constructed. The ranch prospered, his bank account grew, and his heart remained safely locked away where it couldn't be broken again. The north gate came into view as Ranger topped a small rise, the wrought iron barrier standing like a formal announcement between Bear's private world and everything beyond it. He'd had the gate custom-made when he first bought this section of land, a declaration of ownership and boundaries that had seemed important at the time. Now it struck him as oddly theatrical, like a costume from a play. He no longer remembered auditioning for Dot as Bear approached the gate. Something seemed wrong with the landscape. A splash of color near the base of the iron posts caught his attention, something that didn't belong in the muted palette of summer grass and native brush. He urged Ranger closer, squinting against the glare of the noon sun. What he found changed. Everything. A young woman lay crumpled beside his gate, her body folded in on itself like a flower that had wilted in the heat. Her clothes a faded red dress that might once have been beautiful, or dusty and travel-worn, and her dark hair had escaped whatever arrangement it had once held. She looked impossibly small against the vastness of the Texas landscape. A fragile human detail in a picture painted on too large a canvas. Bear dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the ground with a thud that seemed too loud in the sudden silence. Kneeling beside the woman, he could see the rise and fall of her breathing, shallow but steady. Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by a dozen practical questions. Who was she? How had she gotten here? What was he supposed to do with an unconscious stranger on his property? Her face, turned toward him in the dirt, showed the delicate bone structure of someone very young, though the shadows under her eyes spoke of troubles that aged beyond years. Her lips were cracked from dehydration, and her skin had the pallor of someone who hadn't eaten well in far too long. One hand clutched a small canvas bag, everything she owned in the world, by the look of it. For a moment it stretched longer than it should have. Bear simply stared at her. Something about the sight stirred memories he'd thought safely buried, awakened protective instincts that had no place in his carefully ordered world. This was exactly the kind of complication he'd spent years learning to avoid a person in need. A problem with no simple solution. A disruption to the peaceful isolation he'd worked so hard to achieve. The smart thing would be to call Tommy. Have him drive the woman to town where the proper authorities could sort out her situation. Bear had learned through hard experience that getting involved in other people's problems led to nothing but heartache and complications he was better off avoiding. But as he looked down at her face, peacefully unconscious in the shade of his gate, Barrett Coltrane felt something shift inside his chest, a crack in the armor he'd spent so many years constructing. Whether he wanted it or not, this young woman had just become his responsibility. The question was what he intended to do about it. Bear lifted Elena as gently as he could manage, surprised by how little she weighed in his arms. She stirred slightly as he settled her across Ranger's saddle, her eyelids fluttering, but not quite opening. The horse stood perfectly still, as if sensing the delicate nature of his cargo, while Bear mounted behind her and turned toward the house. The ride back seemed to take forever, each step measured and careful to avoid jostling his unconscious passenger. Elena's head rested against his chest, and he could feel the fever burning through her thin dress. Whatever had driven her to collapse at his gate, it had been building for days, maybe weeks. At the house, Bear carried her inside and settled her. On the leather sofa in his living room, the first time in years another person had occupied that space. He fetched cool water and clean towels, drawing on half-remembered knowledge from his military days about treating heat exhaustion and dehydration. Gently dabbing her face and wrists with the damp cloth, he watched for signs of improvement. Elena's eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then widening with alarm as she took in her surroundings. She tried to sit up too quickly and swayed, one hand pressing to her forehead. "Easy now," Bear said, his voice gentler than he'd intended. "You're safe. You collapsed outside my gate." She looked at him with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to trespass. I was just resting for a minute. When did you last eat?" he asked, though her hollow cheeks already suggested the answer. Elena's hesitation told him everything. "Yesterday morning. Maybe the day before." She attempted another smile, this one more apologetic than grateful. "I can work for food. I'm good with animals, and I learn fast." Bear studied her face, noting the pride that kept her spine straight despite her obvious weakness. "What's your name?" Elena Cruz. She glanced toward the door as if calculating her chances of making it that far. "I should go. I don't want to cause trouble." "You're not causing trouble," Bear found himself saying, though part of him wondered if that was true. "But you're not going anywhere until you've had something to eat and some rest." Over the next hour, as Elena slowly consumed a bowl of beef stew and several glasses of water, pieces of her story emerged. She'd been traveling with Carson's Continental, Carnival, working as a performer, and helping with the animals. When the Carnival went bankrupt in El Paso, the owner had disappeared, leaving his workers stranded with nothing but unpaid wages and a pile of debts. "Some of us tried to stick together," Elena explained, her voice growing stronger with food and hydration. "But people had families to get back to, places to go. I didn't have anywhere, so I started walking." "Walking where?" She shrugged, a gesture that tried for nonchalance, but couldn't quite hide the desperation underneath. "East, I guess. Figured I'd find work in one of the towns." Bear wanted to ask more questions about her family, her past, what had driven her to join in traveling. Carnival in the first place, but something in her posture warned him off. Elena Cruz had secrets, and she wasn't ready to share them with a stranger. No matter how kind he'd been Dot as evening approached, Bear found himself in unfamiliar territory. Common decency demanded he offer her a place to sleep for the night, but his carefully maintained solitude rebelled against the idea of another person in his house. Elena seemed to sense his internal struggle. "I could sleep in the barn," she offered. "I'm used to making do." "The guest room will be fine," Bear replied, making the decision before his doubts could override his conscience. "We'll figure out." "What comes next in the morning?" Elena's relief was palpable, though she tried to hide it. "Thank you. I'll earn my keep, I promise." That night, Bear lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person in his house water running in the guest bathroom. The creak of floorboards, the soft closing of a door. For the first time in years, the grandfather clock's chiming didn't echo through empty rooms. The next morning brought visitors Bear hadn't expected. Two men in an expensive sedan pulled up to his house just after breakfast, their city clothes and predatory smiles immediately putting him on edge. Elena, who'd been helping him feed the chickens, froze when she saw the car. "Elena Cruz," the larger man called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a debt collector. "We've been looking for you, sweetheart." Bear felt Elena shrink against his side, her entire body tensing with fear. "Who are they?" he asked quietly. "Trouble," she whispered back. "The kind that doesn't give up." The men approached with the confident swagger of people accustomed to getting their way through intimidation. The larger one, clearly the leader, smiled at Bear with practiced charm. "Sorry to bother you, sir. I'm Eddie Morales, and this is my associate. We're here about a debt situation with the young lady." Bear stepped slightly in front of Elena, a movement that didn't go unnoticed. "This is private property. State your business or leave." Eddie's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened. "Miss Cruz here owes my employer a considerable sum of money we're here to collect." "I told you," Elena said, finding her voice. "I don't have it. The Carnival went bankrupt. Nobody got paid. That's not our problem, sweetheart. You signed the contract. The debt follows you wherever you go." Bear's military instincts, dormant for decades, suddenly came alive. These men weren't legitimate creditors. They were predators, and Elena was their prey. The crumpled piece of paper Eddie pulled from his jacket confirmed his suspicions. The document looked official enough to fool someone desperate, but Bear had seen enough contracts in his business dealings to spot the inconsistencies. "Let me see that," Bear said, extending his hand. Eddie hesitated, then handed over the paper. Bear read quickly, his experienced eye catching the legal flaws and impossible. Terms. The document claimed Elena owed nearly $50,000 for training, room, board, and equipment, with interest accumulating daily at rates that would make a loan shark blush. "This isn't legal," Bear said flatly, handing the paper back. "This is exploitation." Eddie's facade finally cracked. "Legal's got nothing to do with it, old man. The girl owes money, and we're here to collect. One way or another." The threat hung in the air like smoke, heavy and acrid. Bear felt something ancient and dangerous stir in his chest, the protective fury of a man whose territory had been invaded. "By wolves, you need to leave," Bear said, his voice dropping to a register that made both men take an involuntary step backward. "Now." Eddie's hand moved toward his jacket, but Bear's own movement was faster and more decisive. The shotgun he kept by the door for dealing with coyotes suddenly appeared in his hands, not quite pointed at the visitors, but not exactly pointed away either. "I said leave." The two men retreated to their car, but Eddie called out through the window as they drove away, "This isn't over. The girl comes with us, or you'll wish she had." Bear watched until the sedan disappeared down his drive, then turned to find Elena staring at him with a mixture of gratitude and terror. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "They always come back." "How much do you really owe?" Bear asked. Elena pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket. The real contract, not the forgery Eddie had shown him. Bear read it carefully, his anger building with each line. Elena had been promised work as a performer, but had been charged for everything from her costume to her meals at inflated prices designed to keep her perpetually in debt. The carnival had operated like a modern company store, trapping workers in a cycle of obligation they could never escape. $2,000, Elena said, her voice barely audible. "But they're claiming it's much more with their made-up interest. And fees." Bear looked at the young woman who'd stumbled into his carefully ordered world, seeing her clearly for the first time. She wasn't just a complication or a temporary responsibility. She was someone in genuine danger, someone who needed protection he was uniquely positioned to provide. The smart thing would still be to pay her bus fare to somewhere far away and wash his hands of the whole situation. But as Bear looked into Elena's dark eyes, seeing the fear she was trying so hard to hide, he realized that smart and right were always the same thing. "You'll stay here," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice, "at least until we figure this out." Elena's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "You don't understand what you're getting into. These people don't give up." Bear shouldered the shotgun, his jaw set with determination he hadn't felt in years. "Neither do I." The old branding iron hung on the wall of Bear's study like a piece of family history forged in steel and hardship. His father had used it to mark 3 generations of coal-train cattle, and his grandfather before him had wielded it when this land was still wild country, where a man's word and his brand were the only law that mattered. Now, as Bear sat at his desk reviewing ranch accounts, the iron seemed to watch him with the weight of family expectations he'd never quite learned to carry. Elena had been on the ranch for 5 days, and already the rhythms of Bear's carefully ordered life were shifting in ways both subtle and profound. She'd insisted on earning her keep from the moment she felt strong enough to work, and to Bear's surprise, she'd proven remarkably capable with the animals. The horses, in particular, seemed drawn to her gentle touch and patient manner. "She's got a gift," Tommy had commented that morning, watching Elena work with a skittish moire that had been difficult to handle since arriving from the auction barn. "Horse hasn't let anyone else get close enough to check that cut on her leg." Bear had watched from the fence as Elena approached the injured animal, speaking in soft Spanish that seemed to calm the moire's nerves. Within minutes, she was examining the wound and applying the antiseptic salve, her movements confident and sure. The sight stirred something in Bear that he couldn't quite name, a mixture of admiration and something deeper, more dangerous. Where? Did you learn to handle horses like that? He'd asked later, as they walked back toward the house. Elena's smile had been both proud and wistful. My grandfather. He worked on a ranch in Mexico before he came north. He used to say that horses and people aren't so different. They both need to trust before they can love. Now, as Bear tried to focus on the column of numbers in his ledger, he found his attention drifting to the sound of Elena's voice drifting through the open window. She was singing softly in Spanish as she hung laundry on the line, a task she'd taken upon herself despite his protests that he'd been managing his own washing for years. The song was one he didn't recognize, something haunting and beautiful that spoke of loss and longing in a language he only partially understood. But the emotion in her voice was universal, and it touched something in Bear that had been dormant for too long. He set down his pen and walked to the window, watching Elena work. She'd borrowed one of his old shirts to wear over her dress, and the sleeves were rolled up to reveal slender arms that moved with practiced efficiency. The morning sun caught the highlights in her dark hair, and for a moment Bear found himself thinking about what it might feel like to run his fingers through those silken strands. The thought shocked him with its intensity. He'd been so careful, so disciplined about keeping his emotions locked away. But Elena's presence in his house was like a key, turning in a lock he'd thought permanently secured. "Boss?" Tommy's voice from the doorway brought Bear back to the present. "Sorry to interrupt, but we've got a situation with the fence line near Miller's Creek. Looks like someone cut the wire deliberately." Bear felt his jaw tighten. "How much damage?" "About 100 yards of fence down, and some of the cattle wandered onto the neighbor's property. Nothing we can't fix, but it's going to take most of the day." Bear nodded, already reaching for his hat. "I'll be right there." As they worked to repair the damage, Bear couldn't shake the feeling that the vandalism was connected to Elena's presence. The timing was too convenient, the location too strategic. Someone was sending a message, and Bear was receiving it loud and clear. "You think this is about the girl?" Tommy asked, voicing the question Bear had been avoiding. "Could be," Bear admitted, stretching a new section of wire between the posts. "Those men who came by the other day didn't strike me as the type to give up easily." Tommy worked in silence for a moment, then said, "You know there's going to be talk in town about you keeping a young woman on the ranch." Bear's hands stilled on the wire. He'd been so focused on Elena's immediate safety that he hadn't considered how their arrangement might look to others. In a small community like theirs, gossip traveled faster than wildfire, and reputations could be destroyed by nothing more than speculation and innuendo. "Let them talk," he said finally, surprised by his own vehemence. "I'm not doing anything wrong." "I know that," Tommy said quickly. "But you might want to consider what's best for her. Young woman like that, she's got her whole life ahead of her. Might not be fair to keep her tied to a place like this." The words hit Bear harder than he expected. Of course, Tommy was right. Elena deserved more than to be hidden away on a remote ranch, protected from the world like some kind of prisoner. She was young, beautiful, talented. In time, she'd want things he couldn't provide. A real relationship, children, a future that didn't revolve around the isolated rhythms of ranch life. But even as he acknowledged the logic of Tommy's words, Bear felt something rebellious rise in his chest. Elena had found safety here, had begun to heal from whatever wounds had driven her to his gate. Wasn't that worth something? That evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset over the pastures, Bear found himself studying Elena's profile. In the golden light, she'd been quieter than usual during dinner, and he wondered if she was having second thoughts about staying. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, using an expression his mother had favored. Elena turned to him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I was thinking about my grandfather again. He used to tell me stories about the old days, when he was young and everything seemed possible." "What kind of stories?" "Adventures, mostly. He'd traveled all over Mexico and the Southwest, working different ranches, learning about horses and cattle. He said those were the best years of his life when he was free to go anywhere, do anything. Elena's voice grew wistful. Sometimes I wonder if I should have been more like him, kept moving instead of trying to settle down with the carnival. Bear felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Are you thinking about leaving? The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to face. Elena was quiet for so long that Bear began to think she wouldn't answer. I don't know, she said finally. I can't stay here forever, hiding from my problems. And you've got your own life, your own routine. I don't want to be a burden. You're not a burden, Bear said, the words coming out more forcefully than he'd intended. You're? He stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. What was Elena to him? A guest? A responsibility? Something more dangerous and precious than either? I'm what? Elena asked softly. Bear looked at her, sitting there in the fading light, with his oversized shirt draped over her shoulders, and felt his carefully constructed walls crumble a little more. You're welcome here, he said finally, for as long as you want to stay. Elena's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face. Thank you, she whispered. That means more than you know. Later that night, as Bear lay in his bed listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling, he thought about the branding iron hanging in his study. His father had taught him that a brand was more than just a mark of ownership. It was a symbol of belonging, of being part of something larger than yourself. For the first time in years, Bear found himself wondering what it would feel like to belong to someone again, to have his life intertwined with another's in all the messy, complicated ways that made existence meaningful. The thought terrified him, but as he drifted off to sleep, Elena's voice echoing in his memory, Bear realized that terror wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it was just another word for being alive. Bear discovered Elena's hidden talent quite by accident. He'd been looking for his reading glasses, checking the usual places where he absent-mindedly left them, when he noticed a sketchbook tucked between two feed catalogs on the kitchen counter. The leather cover was worn smooth from handling, and it fell open in his hands to reveal a drawing that made him catch his breath. It was himself, captured in charcoal and pencil, with an artist's eye for detail that went beyond mere technical skill. Elena had drawn him standing by the corral fence, his attention focused on something in the distance, and somehow she'd managed to convey not just his physical presence, but something deeper, the weight he carried, the solitude that surrounded him like an invisible barrier. It was how she saw him, and the intimacy of that perspective made Bear feel exposed in a way that had nothing to do with clothing. He turned the page to find more drawings. Tommy working with a rope, Pete adjusting. A windmill, the horses in various poses of rest and motion. Each sketch showed Elena's growing familiarity with ranch life, but they also revealed something else, an artist's soul that had been suppressed by the harsh necessities of survival. You weren't supposed to see those. Bear turned to find Elena, standing in the doorway, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She'd been gathering eggs from the henhouse, and she still carried the basket in one hand. These are remarkable, Bear said, closing the sketchbook gently. You have real talent. Elena set down the egg basket and reached for her drawings, but Bear held them just out of reach. When did you start drawing? When I was little. My mother had some art supplies that she'd kept from school, and she showed me how to use them. Elena's voice grew soft with memory. She said art was a way of capturing moments so they wouldn't disappear. What happened to her? The question slipped out before Bear could stop it, and he saw Elena's face close off slightly. She'd shared bits of her story over the past week, but always in fragments, never the complete picture. She died when I was 16, Elena said finally. Cancer. That's when I started moving around more, trying to find work, trying to find a place where I belonged. Bear handed her the sketchbook, watching as she clutched it against her chest like a shield. "Is that what led you to the carnival?" Elena nodded. They promised steady work, a place to stay, people who'd become like family. It sounded perfect. For someone with nowhere else to go, but it wasn't. No. Elena's laugh held no humor. It was the opposite of everything they promised. But I learned things there, how to perform, how to work with animals, how to take care of myself when no one else would. She looked up at Bear with eyes that held both vulnerability and strength. How to keep drawing, even when it felt like there was nothing beautiful left in the world. Bear felt something shift in his chest, like a locked door opening after years of rust and disuse. "Would you show me more of your work?" Elena hesitated, then carried the sketchbook to the kitchen table. She opened it to the first page, where a younger version of herself smiled out from the paper, a girl who still believed in happy endings and safe harbors. "This is from before," Elena said, "when I thought I knew how my life would turn out." Bear studied the self-portrait, noting the hope in those charcoal eyes, the confidence in the set of the shoulders. "What did you think would happen?" "The usual things, I guess. Marriage, children, a little house somewhere with a garden and a dog." Elena turned the page to reveal a series of sketches showing carnival life, the bright chaos of the midway, the animals in their cages, the worn faces of people who'd given up their dreams for the illusion of belonging somewhere. Instead, I learned that safety is usually temporary, and family isn't always the people you're related to. As Elena continued turning pages, Bear saw her story unfold in graphite and charcoal. The drawings grew more sophisticated as her circumstances grew harsher, as if hardship had refined her artistic vision while crushing her spirit. There were portraits of carnival workers, studies of animals, landscapes sketched from the back, of moving trucks. Each image told a piece of the story Elena couldn't quite put into words. "This one's my favorite," she said, stopping at a drawing of an old horse, head down in a field of grass. "His name was Cisco. He was ancient when I met him. Probably should have been put out to pasture years earlier, but he still worked every day. The children loved riding him because he was so gentle." "What happened to him?" "When the carnival went broke, they sold all the animals to whoever would take them. I never found out where Cisco ended up." Elena's finger traced the horse's outline on the paper. "I hope he found a good home." Bear looked at the drawing, seeing not just artistic skill, but genuine love for the subject. "You miss him." "I miss the idea of him," Elena corrected. "He represented something constant in a world where everything else was always changing. Does that make sense?" Bear nodded, understanding more than Elena realized. Hadn't he spent the last 15 years seeking exactly that kind of constancy, that freedom from the pain of caring too much? "Would you draw something for me?" he asked. Impulsively, Elena looked surprised. "What would you like?" Bear thought for a moment, then said, "The ranch. But not just what it looks like, what it feels like, what it means." Elena studied his face, as if trying to read the emotions he kept so carefully hidden. "That might take a while." "I'm not going anywhere," Bear replied, and realized, as he said it, that he meant more than just the afternoon. Over the next few days, Bear found himself watching Elena work on her new project. She carried the sketchbook with her as she went about her chores, stopping occasionally to capture some detail that caught her artist's eye. He saw her sketching the play of light through the barn doors, the way the cattle gathered under the old oak tree during the heat of the day, the weathered hands of Pete Morrison as he repaired a bridle. But it was the drawing she made of him that surprised Bear the most. She caught him one evening as he stood on the porch, looking out over the pastures he'd worked so hard to build. When she showed him the finished sketch later, he saw himself through her eyes again. But this time, instead of solitude and burden, she'd captured something warmer. The way she'd drawn the light falling across his face suggested peace rather than loneliness, contentment rather than isolation. "Is that really how you see me?" he asked. Elena looked up from the drawing, her dark eyes serious. "That's how you look when you think no one's watching. Like you've found exactly where you belong." The observation unsettled Bear more than he cared to admit. He'd spent so many years thinking of the ranch as a fortress, a place to hide from the complications of human connection. But Elena saw it differently, not as a retreat from life, but as a foundation for it. That night, as he sat in his study reviewing the day's work, Bear found his gaze drawn repeatedly to the family branding iron on the wall. For the first time in years, he found himself thinking not about the burden of legacy, but about the possibility of creating something new, something that honored the past while embracing an uncertain but potentially wonderful future. The sound of Elena's voice drifted in from the kitchen where she was cleaning up after dinner, humming one of her Spanish songs. The melody was different tonight, lighter, more hopeful, and Bear realized that she was healing here, just as he was beginning to heal in ways he hadn't expected. He pulled out a piece of paper and began making notes, not about cattle or feed, prices or fence repairs, but about the changes he might make to accommodate a more permanent guest. The guest room could become a proper bedroom. The small room off the kitchen might make a good studio, with windows facing north for the best light. Bear stopped writing, startled by the direction of his thoughts. He was planning for Elena to stay, not just for days or weeks, but indefinitely. The realization should have terrified him, should have sent him scrambling back behind the walls he'd so carefully constructed. Instead, for the first time in 15 years, Bear felt something that might have been hope. The small velvet box had been hidden in Bear's desk drawer for 20 years, wrapped in tissue paper and buried beneath old tax documents like a secret too painful to examine. His mother's wedding ring, a simple gold band with a modest diamond that had somehow managed to catch light even in the darkest times, had been waiting there since her death, along with a dozen excuses for why he'd never known what to do with it. Now, as spring painted the Texas hill country in shades of green and gold, Bear found himself thinking about that ring more often than he cared to admit. Elena had been on the ranch for 6 weeks, and what had started as temporary shelter had evolved into something that felt dangerously close to permanent. She'd woven herself into the fabric of his daily life so seamlessly that Bear sometimes forgot there had ever been a time before her presence. The changes were everywhere, some subtle and others impossible to ignore. The house smelled different. Now, not just Elena's faint perfume, but the scent of fresh bread baking, of flowers she'd cut from the wild patches near the creek, of life being lived rather than simply endured. She'd rearranged furniture to catch better light, hung her artwork on walls that had been bare for years, and somehow made the cavernous rooms feel like spaces meant for human habitation rather than storage. Was the sound of her laughter that had truly transformed the place. Elena found joy in the smallest things. A foal taking its first steps, perfect sunset, the way the barn cats would follow her around hoping for scraps. Her delight was infectious, and Bear caught himself smiling at moments when he should have been focused on serious ranch business. "You're different," Tommy had observed that morning as they worked on replacing a section of fence that had been damaged by winter storms. "Haven't seen you this relaxed in years." Bear had pretended not to hear the comment, but it echoed in his mind as he watched Elena work with the horses in the corral. She'd taken over most of their training, and the results were remarkable. Animals that had been skittish and unpredictable were now responding to her touch with an eagerness that spoke of trust earned rather than demanded. "She's got a gift," Pete Morrison had said, leaning against the fence beside Bear. "Reminds me of your grandmother, the way she could gentle a horse just by talking to it." The comparison had startled Bear. His grandmother had been legendary in the county for her way with animals, and Pete was old enough to remember her in her prime. If he saw similarities between Elena and the woman who'd helped build the Coltrane legacy, it meant Elena truly belonged here in ways that went beyond temporary convenience. That afternoon, Bear found Elena in the kitchen, flour dusting her apron, as she rolled out dough for what would become the evening's biscuits. She'd taken over most of the cooking without being asked, and Bear had discovered that sharing meals with another person was a pleasure he'd forgotten. He missed. "I've been thinking," Elena said without looking up from her work, "about what you said the other day, about making improvements to the ranch." Bear poured himself a cup of coffee and settled into his chair at the kitchen table, content to watch her work. "What kind of improvements?" "Well, that back pasture could support more cattle if you fixed the drainage problem. And the old barn could be converted into stables for the horses you've been talking about breeding." Elena's eyes lit up with enthusiasm as she spoke. "You've got the land and the resources to expand, but you're thinking too small." The criticism should have stung, but Bear found himself intrigued by Elena's perspective. She'd been observing the ranch operation with an outsider's eye, seeing possibilities he'd missed because he was too close to the day-to-day details. "What else?" he asked. Elena wiped her hands on her apron and joined him at the table. "You could offer boarding services for people who want to stable their horses but don't have facilities, and riding lessons. There are plenty of families in town who'd pay good money for their children to learn proper horsemanship." Bear considered her suggestions, impressed by their practicality. That would mean more people around the place. "You? Sure you'd want that?" Elena's smile was answer enough. "I think I've been hiding long enough, don't you?" The conversation stayed with Bear as he made his evening rounds, checking on the cattle and securing the barns for the night. Elena's vision of an expanded operation appealed to him in ways that went beyond financial considerations. It would mean the ranch was growing rather than simply maintaining, creating rather than just preserving. But it would also mean commitment to the future, to the community, to the idea that life was meant to be lived in partnership rather than isolation. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Bear found himself studying Elena's profile in the soft light from the house. She'd changed in the weeks since her arrival, growing stronger and more confident as her health improved and her fears faded. The hollow-cheeked waif who'd collapsed at his gate had been replaced by a woman who radiated quiet strength and contentment. "What are you thinking about?" Elena asked, catching him staring. "The future," Bear admitted. "I've spent so many years focused on just keeping things running that I forgot about actually building something." Elena turned to face him fully, her dark eyes serious. "What would you build if you could do anything?" The question was deceptively simple, but it cut straight to the heart of fears Bear had been carrying for decades. What did he want? What was worth the risk of caring, of investing, of opening himself up to the possibility of loss? "I'd want to build something that would last," he said finally. "Something that would still matter after I'm gone." "Like what?" Bear looked out over the land his family had worked for 3 generations, seeing it through Elena's eyes as a place of potential rather than just responsibility. Like a partnership, like a family business that could be passed down, like a home that was more than just a place to sleep. Elena was quiet for a long moment, and Bear wondered if he'd revealed too much. But when she spoke, her voice was soft with understanding. "That sounds like a beautiful dream." "Dreams can be dangerous," Bear replied, voicing the fear that had kept him alone for so long. "The bigger they are, the more they hurt when they fall apart." Elena reached over and placed her hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "But what if they don't fall apart? What if they're strong enough to last?" Bear looked down at her hand, so small against his weathered forearm, and felt something fundamental shift in his chest. The walls he'd built around his heart weren't just protecting him from pain. They were also keeping out the possibility of joy. "I don't know if I remember how to take that kind of chance," he admitted, Elena's smile was radiant with understanding. Maybe that's something we could figure out together. Later that night, alone in his study, Bear pulled out the velvet box and opened it for the first time in years. His mother's ring caught the lamplight and threw it back in tiny rainbows, a promise of beauty even in the darkest moments. He'd been saving it for the right woman, the right time, the right circumstances. As he held the ring up to the light, Bear found himself wondering if perhaps he'd been thinking about it all wrong. Maybe the right woman wasn't someone who would complete his life. Maybe she was someone who would help him build a new one. The sound of Elena's footsteps in the hallway above reminded him that he wasn't alone anymore, that the choice to remain isolated was no longer the only option available to him. For the first time in 20 years, Barrett Coltrane allowed himself to imagine a future that included more than just survival. He closed the ring box and placed it back in the drawer. But this time he left it on top of the other papers where he could find it easily, just in case. The music box was smaller than Bear had expected, no larger than his palm, with a painted circus scene that had faded with age and handling. When Elena wound the tiny key, it played a melancholy waltz that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 midway nights and broken dreams. She'd kept it hidden among her few possessions until this evening, when something in their conversation had prompted her to share this last piece of her former life. "My mother gave it to me," Elena said, her voice soft with memory as the tinkling melody filled the quiet kitchen. "She found it at a thrift store when I was 8. Said it reminded her of the music they played at the county fair where she met my father." Bear watched the tiny figures inside the box spin in their eternal dance. Ringmaster and a carousel horse frozen in perpetual motion. There was something both beautiful and heartbreaking about their endless circle, never moving forward, but never stopping either. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "The carnival life?" Elena considered the question as the music box wound down, the melody growing slower and more distorted before finally stopping. "I miss the idea of it. The romance, the adventure, the sense that every day could bring something new." She smiled, but there was sadness in it. "I was so young when I joined them. I thought it would be like the stories my mother used to tell." What was it really like? Elena rewound the music box, but this time she closed the lid before the figures could begin their dance. Mostly it was about survival, making enough money to eat, finding a safe place to sleep, trying to stay one step ahead of whatever trouble was following us. She looked up at Bear, her dark eyes reflecting depths of experience. It seemed too heavy for someone so young. "I kept this because it reminded me of who I used to be before I learned that fairy tales don't always have happy endings." Bear felt an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with his own losses. Elena had entered his life carrying wounds that paralleled his own, and seeing her pain made him understand something about the walls they'd both built around their hearts. "Maybe the problem isn't with fairy tales," he said carefully. "Maybe it's about finding the right story." Elena's smile was more genuine this time. "Is that what you think this is? A fairy tale?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications that neither was quite ready to address directly. Bear looked around the kitchen that had become the heart of their shared life. Elena's drawings taped to the refrigerator, her apron hanging on the hook by the stove, the comfortable disorder of two people learning to live together. "I think," Bear said slowly, "that I stopped believing in stories where people get what they want. But lately, I've been wondering if maybe I gave up too soon." Elena reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, her touch warm and steady. "What would you want if you let yourself believe again?" The question was one Bear had been avoiding for weeks, afraid that naming his desires would somehow jinx them or reveal how desperately he'd begun to hope for things he'd thought were beyond his reach. "I'd want to wake up every morning knowing that the day ahead would include someone who understood why this place matters to me," he said, surprised by his own honesty. I'd want to share the work and the worry and the small victories that make it all worthwhile. And, Elena prompted gently. Bear looked into her eyes and felt the last of his resistance crumble. And I'd want to know that when I'm gone, someone will remember not just what I built, but who I was when I was building it. Elena's eyes glistened with unshed tears. That sounds like a beautiful want. It's a dangerous want, Bear replied. The kind that changes everything. Elena nodded, understanding the weight of what he wasn't quite saying. Change isn't always bad, Bear. Sometimes it's just another word for growing. That night, as they worked together to clean up after dinner, Bear found himself acutely aware of the domestic intimacy of their routine. Elena washed while he dried, their movements synchronized by weeks of practice. When she handed him a plate, their fingers would brush, sending small electric shocks through his nervous system. When she reached past him to put something away, he caught the faint scent of her hair and had to concentrate on not pulling her closer. The sexual tension that had been building between them for weeks was becoming harder to ignore. Bear caught Elena watching him sometimes, her gaze lingering on his hands or the line of his shoulders in a way that made his pulse quicken. And he knew she was aware of his attention to her, the way his eyes followed her movements, the way his breathing changed when she stood too close. But neither of them had made the move that would transform their careful friendship into something more complicated and potentially wonderful. Bear suspected they were both afraid of destroying what they built by wanting too much too soon. I've been thinking about what you said, Elena said as she hung up the dish towel, about expanding the ranch operation. Bear welcomed the safer topic, though part of him wished they could address the elephant in the room. What about it? I'd like to help, not just with the work, but with the planning, the decision-making. Elena turned to face him, her expression serious. I want to be a real partner in whatever we build here. The word partner hit Bear like a physical blow. It implied permanence, shared responsibility, a future that included both of them working side by side. It was everything he'd been hoping for and afraid to ask for. Elena, he said, his voice rougher than intended, you need to understand what you're saying. This isn't just about business. If we do this together, if we really build something together, I know, Elena interrupted, stepping closer to him. I know what I'm saying. They stood there in the kitchen, the evening light fading through the windows, and Bear felt as if they were balanced on the edge of a cliff. One more word, one small gesture, and they would either fall together or retreat to safer ground. Elena made the choice for both of them. Rising on her tiptoes, she pressed a soft kiss to his cheek, her lips lingering just long enough to make her intentions clear. I'm not going anywhere, Bear, she whispered against his ear. Not unless you want me to. Bear closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the rush of emotions her words unleashed. Want? Want didn't begin to cover what he felt for Elena Cruz. He wanted her with a desperation that terrified him, needed her with an intensity that went against every lesson he'd learned about self-protection. When he opened his eyes, Elena was watching him with a mixture of hope and vulnerability that made his chest tight. I want you to stay, he said simply, for as long as you'll have me. Elena's smile was radiant. That might be a very long time. I'm counting on it, Bear replied, and meant every word. Later, as he sat alone on the porch, listening to Elena move around upstairs, Bear thought about the music box and its endless dance. Maybe the beauty wasn't in reaching a destination, but in finding someone willing to dance the same steps, to share the same rhythm, to create something beautiful out of the simple act of moving through life together. For the first time in 20 years, Barrett Coltrane was ready to take that chance. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other, with Bear and Elena sharing coffee and planning the day's work over breakfast. Tommy had brought the mail up from the road, along with his usual report on the cattle, and Bear had set the stack of envelopes aside to deal with after more pressing ranch business. It wasn't till that evening, as he sat in his study updating the books, that he noticed the return address that made his blood run cold. Dr. Patricia Henley, Oncology Associates. Bear stared at the envelope for a long moment, his hand trembling slightly as memories of his last visit to the doctor flooded back. He'd been putting off the follow-up appointment for months, telling himself he was too busy with spring calving and fence repairs. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. He'd been afraid of what Dr. Henley might tell him. The examination 6 months ago had found irregularities that required further monitoring. Bear had been through enough health scares with aging relatives to know that doctors didn't use phrases like that when they expected good news. But he'd managed to push the worry aside, to lose himself in the daily routines of ranch life, and more recently, in the unexpected joy of Elena's presence. With the letter in his hands, all of those carefully suppressed fears came rushing back. Bear opened the envelope with the deliberate care of a man disarming a bomb. The letter was brief and professional, requesting that he schedule an appointment as soon as possible to discuss your recent test results. The neutral language couldn't hide the urgency behind the request. Bear? Elena's voice from the doorway made him look up. She stood framed in the entrance to his study, her hair loose around her shoulders and concern written across her features. Is everything all right? Bear's first instinct was to hide the letter, to protect Elena from the worry that was already eating at his insides. But as he looked at her face open, trusting, full of the love they'd been dancing around for weeks, he realized that keeping secrets would be a betrayal of everything they'd built together. I need to call my doctor, he said simply, holding up the letter. Elena's face went pale, but she didn't ask questions. Instead, she crossed the room and settled into the chair beside his desk, her presence a quiet offer of support that Bear found both comforting and devastating. The phone call to Dr. Henley's office was brief and terrifying. Yes, they could see him tomorrow afternoon. No, they couldn't discuss specifics over the phone. Yes, he should probably bring someone with him. Bear hung up the phone and looked at Elena, who had been listening to his half of the conversation with growing alarm. What kind of test results? She asked quietly. Bear told her about the routine physical that had revealed elevated markers, about the follow-up tests that had found areas of concern, about the months of denial that had brought him to this moment. As he spoke, he watched Elena's face cycle through shock, fear, and finally a fierce determination that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her. I'm coming with you, she said when he finished. Elena, no arguments, she said firmly. We're partners, remember? That means we face things together. Bear felt his throat close with emotion. Here was this remarkable woman, who'd already endured more loss and disappointment than anyone should have to bear, offering to stand beside him as he faced the possibility of his own mortality. The generosity of it overwhelmed him. You don't know what you're signing up for, he said. If this is what I think it is, then we'll deal with it, Elena interrupted. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together. That night, Bear lay awake, staring at the ceiling and thinking about time. For 62 years, he'd lived as if he had an unlimited supply of tomorrows, as if there would always be another season to plan for, another year to build toward. The possibility that his time might be measured in months rather than decades changed everything. More than that, it made him realize how much of his life he'd wasted on fear. Fear of commitment, fear of loss, fear of the pain that came with caring deeply about another person. He'd been so focused on protecting himself from hurt that he'd missed most of the opportunities for joy. Elena had changed all of that. In the few months since her arrival, she'd shown him what it meant to live fully, to embrace each day as a gift, rather than simply an obligation to be endured. Now, when he might finally be ready to build the life he'd always wanted, time might be running out. The next afternoon, as they sat in Dr. Henley's sterile office waiting for test results, Bear found himself studying Alana's hands as she clasped them tightly in her lap. She'd insisted on coming despite his protests, and her presence was the only thing keeping him anchored as his world tilted on its axis. "Mr. Coltrane," Dr. Henley said as she entered the room, her expression carefully neutral. "Thank you for coming in so quickly." Bear had known Patricia Henley for 15 years, had trusted her with his health, and respected her honesty. Now, as she settled behind her desk with his file, he braced himself for the conversation that would define whatever future he had left. "Not going to sugarcoat this," Dr. Henley began. "The biopsy results show that you have prostate cancer. The good news is that we caught it relatively early. The challenging news is that given the location and the aggressiveness of the cells we found, we need to move quickly." The words hit Bear like a physical blow, even though he'd been expecting them. Cancer, the word that had haunted his nightmares since his father's death, the enemy he'd hoped to avoid through clean living and good genetics. Elena's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his in a grip that was both gentle and fierce. Her touch kept him grounded as Dr. Henley explained treatment options, survival rates, and the importance of immediate action. "What does move quickly mean?" Elena asked, her voice steady despite the tears Bear could see gathering in her eyes. "Surgery within the next month, followed by a course of radiation therapy. With aggressive treatment, Mr. Coltrane has an excellent chance of full recovery." Dr. Henley's tone was encouraging, but Bear heard the unspoken warnings behind her optimism. "And without treatment?" Bear asked. Dr. Henley's expression grew serious. 6 months to a year, possibly less." The silence that followed felt like a chasm opening in the floor. Bear stared at the medical charts on the doctor's wall, seeing not diagnoses and treatment plans, but the sudden, brutal reality that his time was finite in ways he'd never fully understood. "We need some time to process this," Elena said, speaking for both of them when Bear couldn't find his voice. "Of course," Dr. Henley replied, "but don't take too long. Time is not our ally here." The drive home was mostly silent, both of them lost in thoughts too big for words. It wasn't until they were back on the ranch, sitting on the porch as the sun set over the pastures Bear might not live to see flourish again, that Elena finally spoke. "We'll get through this," she said, her voice fierce with determination. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes, we'll fight this together." Bear looked at her, this incredible woman who'd stumbled into his life just when he'd given up on the possibility of love, and felt his heart break with the weight of what he might be asking her to endure. "Elena," he said quietly, "you need to understand what you're committing to. This isn't going to be easy. The treatment, the uncertainty, the possibility that it might not work." "Stop," Elena said, turning to face him fully. "Just stop. Do you think I'm going to walk away from you now? Do you think so little of what we have?" Bear saw the hurt in her eyes and realized that his words had wounded her in ways he hadn't intended. She wasn't just offering to stay out of obligation or pity. She was fighting for their future with the same courage she'd shown in rebuilding her life after the carnival. "I love you," he said, the words coming out raw and honest. "I love you so much that the thought of putting you through this is almost worse than the cancer itself." Elena's smile was radiant through her tears. "Then you understand exactly how I feel about you," she said, "and why I'm not going anywhere." That night, as they held each other in Bear's bed for the first time, their lovemaking was tender and desperate, flavored with the knowledge that their time together might be more precious and more limited than either had imagined. But it was also filled with hope that love might be stronger than fear, that partnership might triumph over uncertainty, that together they might face whatever challenges lay ahead. The cancer had changed everything and nothing. Bear was still the same man who'd found Elena collapsed at his gate, and she was still the woman who taught him that isolation wasn't the same as safety. But now they faced the future with the acute awareness that every day was a gift, every moment an opportunity to build something beautiful in the face of an uncertain tomorrow. As Bear drifted off to sleep with Elena in his arms, he thought about the medical diagnosis letter that had started this day. What had seemed like an ending was perhaps just another beginning, a chance to live fully in whatever time remained, to love completely without reservation, to build a legacy that had nothing to do with the number of years and everything to do with the depth of connection two people could create together. The engagement ring design Elena had sketched in her journal was nothing like the traditional solitaires displayed in jewelry store windows. Instead, she'd drawn something uniquely southwestern, a central stone surrounded by smaller diamonds, arranged like a sunburst, set in a band engraved with a delicate pattern of sage leaves. At the bottom of the page, she'd written in her careful script, "For someone who deserves all the light in the world." Bear found the sketch 3 weeks after his diagnosis, tucked between pages of ranch planning notes Elena had been making. She'd been quietly redesigning his entire operation while he underwent pre-surgical testing, creating detailed drawings of the horse boarding facility, the expanded breeding program, and the teaching arena where local children could learn horsemanship. Every plan assumed a future he might not live to see. Every detail spoke of faith in their partnership that humbled him completely. The ring design undid him entirely. He stood in his study, holding the page with hands that trembled not from fear of the surgery scheduled for the following week, but from the overwhelming realization that Elena had been planning their engagement even as uncertainty clouded their future. The sketch represented everything he'd been too afraid to ask for: permanence, commitment, a shared vision of what their life together could become. "You weren't supposed to find that yet," Elena said from the doorway, her voice soft with embarrassment. Bear looked up to find her watching him, her dark eyes reflecting a mixture of vulnerability and determination that had become familiar over the months of their courtship. She'd grown stronger during his illness, taking on more of the ranch management while supporting him through the medical appointments and treatment planning that had consumed their days. "Were you planning to show it to me?" he asked. Elena stepped into the room and closed the door behind her, a gesture that suggested this conversation required privacy. "I was planning to wait until after the surgery, until we knew." She stopped, unable to finish the sentence that haunted both their thoughts. "Until we knew if I was going to survive," Bear completed gently. Elena nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "I didn't want you to think I was pressuring you or trying to make decisions about our future when yours was so uncertain." Bear set the sketch aside and crossed to her, taking her hands in his. They'd grown calloused from ranch work, these hands that could gentle a frightened horse or create art that captured the soul of the Texas landscape. Now they shook slightly as he raised them to his lips. "Elena," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "there is no uncertainty about our future. Surgery or no surgery, cancer or no cancer, you are my future. You're the only future I want." "But what if—" "No," Bear interrupted firmly. "No what ifs, no contingency plans. No more waiting for the perfect moment when everything is guaranteed to work out." He cupped her face in his hands, looking into eyes that held depths of love he was still learning to accept. "I've wasted too many years being afraid of loss to waste whatever time we have being afraid of commitment." Elena's smile was radiant through her tears. "Are you sure? The surgery, the recovery, the treatment, it's going to be difficult. I don't want you making life-changing decisions while you're scared." Bear laughed, surprising them both. "Sweetheart, I've been scared since the day I found you at my gate. Scared of caring too much. Scared of losing you. Scared of hoping for things I thought were beyond my reach." He brushed away her tears with his thumbs. "Being scared hasn't stopped me from falling in love with you. It's not going to stop me from asking you to marry me." Elena's breath caught in her throat. "Is that what you're doing?" "No," Bear said, his voice growing serious. "What I'm doing is telling you that I want to marry you, that I want to build the life you've been planning. In those notebooks, that I want to face whatever comes next with you as my wife and partner." He paused, studying her face. "The asking part comes later, when I have the ring your design deserves." Elena laughed, the sound bright with joy and relief. "You don't need a ring to ask me, Bear. You just need to ask." "I need to do this right," Bear insisted. "You deserve a proposal that matches the magnitude of what you're giving me. A real engagement, a real wedding, a real celebration of what we're building together." Over the following days, as Bear prepared for surgery, he found himself approaching the future with a clarity he'd never experienced. The cancer had stripped away his illusions about unlimited time, but it had also revealed what truly mattered. Not the size of his bank account or the number of cattle on his land, but the woman who woke up beside him each morning and the partnership they were creating together. Elena threw herself into wedding planning with the same intensity she brought to everything else, though she tried to hide her preparations from Bear. He caught glimpses of her research venue options, catering menus, florist consultations, and realized she was planning not just a ceremony, but a celebration that would announce their commitment to the entire community. "She's been calling around to everyone in the county," Tommy reported with amusement. "Wants to make sure the whole town knows you two are getting married, just as soon as you're ready to make it official." The knowledge that Elena was claiming their relationship so publicly, so proudly, filled Bear with a warmth that had nothing to do with the Texas heat. She wasn't hiding their love or treating it as temporary. She was building a foundation for a shared life that assumed permanence and joy. 3 days before his surgery, Bear made a secret trip to Austin to work with a jeweler who specialized in custom designs. Elena's sketch translated beautifully into gold and diamonds, creating a ring that captured both the elegance of her artistic vision and the strength of the love it represented. The sunburst setting seemed to hold light the way Elena held hope naturally, effortlessly, as if illumination was her essential nature. The night before his surgery, as they sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, Bear felt a peace he'd never experienced. Not the absence of fear. The surgery carried real risks, and the cancer remained a formidable enemy, but the presence of something stronger than fear. Love, yes, but also purpose, partnership, the knowledge that his life had meaning beyond his own survival. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Elena said, her hand finding his in the darkness, "I want you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life." Bear squeezed her fingers, thinking about the ring hidden in his study, about the future they would build together, about the legacy they would create that had nothing to do with medical outcomes and everything to do with the love they'd chosen to nurture. "Tomorrow is just the beginning," he said with quiet certainty. "We're going to have decades of happiness ahead of us." Elena smiled, her faith in their future as unwavering as his had become. "Decades? At least," Bear promised. "Maybe more." That night, for the first time since his diagnosis, Bear slept soundly through the night. Elena's presence beside him, a reminder that some bonds were stronger than uncertainty, some loves deep enough to weather any storm. In the morning, he would face surgery with courage born not from denial of the risks, but from absolute certainty about what he was fighting to preserve. Their future together was no longer a possibility. It was a promise they were both committed to keeping, whatever the cost. Bear's handwritten will lay on his desk like a declaration of faith, each carefully penned line representing a choice that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. He'd written it the night before his surgery, working by lamplight while Elena slept, and now 3 weeks into his recovery, the document seemed prophetic rather than morbid. Every acre of land, every head of cattle, every asset he'd spent 40 years accumulating was left to Elena Cruz, the woman who'd wandered into his life, half-starved and completely transformed his understanding of what it meant to live. The surgery. had been successful beyond Dr. Henley's most optimistic projections. Clear margins, no lymph node involvement, a prognosis that included words like complete recovery and excellent long-term outlook. Bear had awakened from anesthesia to find Elena holding his hand, her face radiant with relief and something deeper, a joy that spoke of shared triumph over more than just cancer. Now, as he sat in his study, reviewing the will one final time, Bear felt the weight of decisions that couldn't be postponed any longer. The ring he'd commissioned sat in its velvet box beside the legal documents, catching the afternoon light and throwing rainbows across the papers that would secure Elena's future regardless of what happened to his own. "You're brooding again," Elena said from the doorway, her voice carrying the gentle teasing that had become one of his favorite sounds. She'd been monitoring his moods carefully since the surgery, watching for signs of depression or anxiety that the doctors had warned might accompany his recovery. "I'm planning," Bear corrected, closing the will and sliding it into the desk drawer. "There's a difference." Elena entered the study and settled into the chair across from his desk, her artist's eye taking in details he thought he'd hidden. "Planning what, exactly?" Bear looked at her, truly look-taking in the way the afternoon sun highlighted the gold threads in her dark hair, the confident way she held herself now that fear no longer drove her daily decisions. The wedding dress pattern she'd been working on that lay partially hidden beneath other papers on the side table. Elena had bloomed during his illness, revealing strengths he suspected even she hadn't known she possessed. "I'm planning to ask you to marry." He said simply. Elena's breath caught, though he knew the proposal itself wasn't a surprise. They'd been moving toward this moment for weeks, dancing around the commitment they both wanted, but had been afraid to claim while uncertainty clouded their future. "Is that a proposal?" she asked, her voice soft with wonder. "No," Bear said, reaching for the ring box. "This is—" He stood and moved around the desk, his body still stiff from surgery, but his resolve absolute. Elena rose to meet him, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, two people who'd found love in the most unexpected circumstances, who'd learned that the best partnerships were forged not in easy times, but in the crucible of shared challenges. Bear dropped to one knee, a movement that sent a sharp pain through his healing incision, but felt absolutely necessary. Some moments required the full ceremony, the complete gesture of respect and commitment that his grandfather would have expected and his grandmother would have treasured. "Elena Cruz," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "6 months ago, I thought I knew what my life was supposed to look like. I thought safety meant solitude, that strength meant independence, that the best way to avoid loss was to avoid love entirely." Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she remained silent, allowing him to find his way through words that carried the weight of transformation. "You proved me wrong about everything," Bear continued. "You showed me that real strength comes from vulnerability, that true safety is found in partnership, that a life without love isn't protection from pain, it's just another kind of dying." He opened the ring box, revealing the sunburst design that had grown from Elena's imagination into sparkling reality. Elena gasped at the sight of her dream made tangible, her free hand rising to cover her mouth in surprise. "This ring is made from your design, because this proposal is built on your vision of what we could be together," Bear said. "You saw possibilities where I saw only problems. You saw a future where I saw only survival. You saw love where I saw only risk." Elena knelt down to face him at eye level, her hands framing his face as tears streamed down her cheeks. "Bear, will you marry me?" he asked, the question carrying months of hope and fear and desperate longing. "Will you be my wife, my partner, my reason for believing that the best parts of life are still ahead of us?" Elena's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face with joy that seemed too large for any single person to contain. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes, of course, yes." Bear slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook slightly from emotion rather than weakness. The sunburst setting caught the light streaming through the study windows, sending patterns of brilliance across the walls that surrounded them with dancing rainbows. Elena stared at the ring, watching the play of light across the diamonds, then looked up at Bear with wonder in her dark eyes. "It's exactly what I imagined. How did you—" "I found your sketch," Bear admitted. "The one tucked in with your ranch planning notes." Elena laughed, the sound bright with happiness and embarrassment. "I can't believe you found that. I was trying to be so careful not to pressure." You never pressured me," Bear said seriously. "You just loved me enough to believe we had a future worth planning for, even when I couldn't see it myself." They held each other there on the study floor, surrounded by the documents and plans that would shape their shared tomorrows. And Bear felt a completion he'd never expected to experience. Not the ending of his story, but the true beginning, moment when he stopped simply surviving and started truly living. "When?" Elena asked, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "When what? When do we get married? Because now that you've asked, I don't want to wait any longer than we have to." Bear pulled back to look at her face, seeing the determination that had first attracted him mixed with the love that had captured him completely. "How long does it take to plan a wedding?" Elena's grin was mischievous. "That depends on how big a wedding you want." Bear thought about the community that had watched their courtship unfold, the ranch hands who'd become family, the neighbors who'd offered support during his illness. Elena was right to want a celebration. Their love deserved to be witnessed, celebrated, claimed publicly as the foundation for whatever came next. "Big enough to include everyone who matters," he said. "Small enough to still feel like us." "I can work with that," Elena said, already mentally organizing details with the efficiency that had transformed his ranch operations. "Give me 2 months. 2 months until we're married?" 2 months until we're husband and wife, Elena corrected, her voice carrying a certainty that made Bear's chest tighten with anticipation. As they sat together in the fading afternoon light, planning a wedding that would unite not just 2 people, but 2 different approaches to life. Bear thought about the will in his desk drawer. He'd written it from a place of love and fear, trying to provide for Alana's future while facing the possibility that he might not share it. Now the document seemed less like an ending and more like a beginning, not a transfer of assets, the foundation for a partnership that would outlast them both. "I love you," he said, the words carrying all the weight of decision and commitment, and hope for what lay ahead. "I love you too," Elena replied, her ring catching the last rays of sunlight as she reached for his hand. "Mrs. Elena Coltrane. I like the sound of that." Bear kissed her then, sealing their engagement with a promise that went beyond words, beyond documents, beyond anything that could be written or planned or controlled. They were choosing each other, choosing love over fear, choosing to build something together that would be greater than the sum of their individual parts. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain in its details, but absolute in its foundation. Whatever challenges came next, they would face them as partners, as husband and wife, as 2 people who'd learned that the greatest risk in life wasn't loving too much, it was not loving at all. Elena's yes remained visible in the dirt for 3 days after she'd traced it there with her finger, a testament written in earth and emotion that neither rain nor wind seemed willing to erase. Bear found himself walking past that spot by the old oak tree repeatedly, drawn to the simple word that represented the most complex decision of his life, finally resolved. She'd written it during their first morning as an engaged couple, when Bear had been showing her the spot where he'd planned to build the new stable block. Elena had knelt down suddenly, overwhelmed by the reality of their commitment, and traced the letters in the soft soil, as if making their promise tangible to the earth itself. "I want the land to know," she'd said when Bear asked about the gesture. "I want everything here to understand that this is permanent, that we're building something that's meant to last." Now, As Bear stood in that same spot 3 weeks later, he understood what Elena had been trying to capture. Their love had taken root here, grown from the soil of shared work and mutual understanding. The word in the dirt had faded, but what it represented had only grown stronger. That the wedding planning had consumed their days with a joyful intensity that surprised them both. Elena threw herself into the preparations with the same passionate attention she brought to her art, transforming their simple ceremony into something that honored both their individual histories and their shared future. She'd insisted on certain traditions: the exchange of rings, the public vows, the celebration with friends and neighbors, while adding personal touches that reflected their unique journey. "I want everyone to understand what this means," she'd told Bear, as they reviewed the guest list that had grown to include most of their small community. "Not just that we're getting married, but that we're claiming this love publicly, without reservation or apology." Bear had been amazed by Elena's transformation from the frightened woman who'd collapsed at his gate to the confident partner who was now orchestrating their future. She'd taken charge of details he would never have considered: flowers that would complement the ranch setting, music that honored both their cultural backgrounds, a menu that reflected the abundance of their shared life. But it was the private moments that moved him most. Elena's quiet concentration as she wrote their personal vows, her tears of joy when the dress she designed was finally finished, her careful planning of small details that would make their wedding day uniquely theirs. "Are you nervous?" Elena asked one evening as they sat on the porch reviewing the final preparations. The wedding was only a week away, and Bear could see the mixture of excitement and anxiety in her eyes. "About marrying you? Never," Bear replied without hesitation. "About deserving you? Every day." Elena turned to face him fully, her expression serious. "Bear Coltrane, you need to understand something. I'm not marrying you because you deserve me or because I deserve you. I'm marrying you because I choose you, because you choose me, because we've built something together that's stronger than either of us alone." Her words hit him with the force of revelation. For months, Bear had been thinking about the relationship in terms of worthiness and earning, as if love was something that had to be deserved rather than freely given. Elena was reminding him that their partnership was based on choice, on the daily decision to build a life together, regardless of who deserved what. "I choose you too," he said simply. "Every day, for the rest of my life?" Elena's smile was radiant. "Then we're going to be just fine." The night before their wedding, Bear lay awake, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around them. Tomorrow, Elena would become his wife, and he would become her husband. The titles seemed both monumental and perfectly natural, as if they'd been moving toward this moment since the day she'd first smiled at him over a bowl of beef stew. Elena stirred beside him, and he realized she was awake too. "Can't sleep either?" she whispered. "Too excited," Bear admitted. "I keep thinking about tomorrow, about what comes after." "What comes after is the rest of our lives," Elena said, her voice soft with wonder. "We get to wake up married, work together, as husband and wife, build the future we've been planning." Bear pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit against his side. "Any regrets? Any second thoughts about tying yourself to an old rancher with a medical history?" Elena propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him with eyes that held no doubt whatsoever. "Barrett Coltrane, I have never been more certain of anything in my life. You are my home, my partner, my future. Tomorrow can't come soon enough." They made love then with a tenderness that spoke of promise and permanence, of two people claiming each other completely as they prepared to make their private commitment public. Afterward, as Elena slept peacefully in his arms, Bear thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, he'd been a man convinced that solitude was safety, that emotional distance was strength. Elena had proved him wrong about everything, showing him that true courage lay in vulnerability, that real strength came from partnership, that the deepest satisfaction in life came from building something with another person that neither could. Create alone. Tomorrow, they would stand before their community and promise to love each other through whatever challenges lay ahead. But Bear knew the real commitment had been made gradually, in quiet moments and shared work, in the daily choice to trust each other with their fears and hopes and dreams. As dawn approached and their wedding day began, Bear felt a peace that had nothing to do with the absence of challenges and everything to do with the presence of the right person to face them with. Elena had taught him that love wasn't about finding someone to complete you. It was about finding someone to grow with, to build with, to become better with. In a few hours, they would exchange rings and vows, seal their partnership with ceremony and celebration. But the real marriage had been happening all along, in every shared meal and difficult conversation, in every moment of support during his illness, in every plan they'd made for their future together. Elena stirred as the first light of their wedding day crept through the bedroom windows, and Bear kissed her forehead gently. "Good morning, future Mrs. Coltrane." Her sleepy smile was radiant with anticipation. "Good morning, future husband. Ready to get married?" "I've been ready since the day I found you," Bear replied, and meant every word. The new cattle brand design lay spread across the kitchen table, its interlocking B and E creating a symbol that would mark their merged lives for generations to come. Elena had drawn it 3 different ways before settling on the version that captured both the strength of Bear's family legacy and the artistic grace she brought to everything she touched. The B formed the foundation, solid and traditional, while the E curved around it like an embrace, the 2 letters creating something entirely new while honoring what had come before. "It's perfect," Bear said, studying the design in the morning. Light that streamed through windows, Elena had adorned with curtains that somehow made the kitchen feel both more elegant and more welcoming. "My grandfather would have approved." Elena smiled as she poured coffee into the mugs that had become theirs, not his or hers, but part of the shared domestic rhythm they created over the 8 months since their wedding. "I hope so. I wanted it to honor your family while announcing that something new was beginning." Bear reached across the table to squeeze her hand, the simple gold band on her finger catching the light in a way that still made his chest tight with gratitude. The wedding had been everything Elena had envisioned, a celebration that brought together their entire community to witness their commitment while feeling intimate enough to honor the quiet love they built together. Their marriage had settled into rhythms that felt both natural and surprising. Elena had transformed not just the house, but the entire ranch operation. Her vision for horse breeding and training bringing new energy and income to land that had supported Coltrane's for 3 generations. The teaching arena she designed was already booked solid with children, whose parents drove from 3 counties away for Elena's gentle but thorough instruction. "Speaking of new beginnings," Elena said, her voice carrying a note that made Bear look up from the brand design with sudden attention. "I have something to tell you." The tone was familiar, the same mixture of excitement and nervousness that had preceded every major announcement in their relationship. Bear set down his coffee and gave her his full attention, noting the flush in her cheeks and the way her free hand rested protectively over her stomach. "Elena?" he prompted gently. "I'm pregnant," she said simply, her smile radiant with joy and anticipation. "Dr. Martinez confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby." Bear felt the world tilt around him, every assumption about his future rearranging itself in an instant. A baby, at 63, when he'd long since given up hope of becoming a father. Elena was offering him the gift of family in its most fundamental form. "Are you sure?" he asked, though the glow in Elena's face made the question unnecessary. "Very sure. About 10 weeks along, which means the baby will arrive in late spring." Elena's voice grew soft with wonder. "Right around the time we'll be registering our new brand and starting the expanded breeding program." Bear stood and moved around the table, pulling Elena into his arms with a gentleness that spoke of precious cargo and overwhelming gratitude. "How do you feel about it?" "Scared," Elena admitted against his shoulder. "Excited, amazed, ready." She pulled back to look into his eyes. "How do you feel about becoming a father?" Bear thought about the question seriously, considering all the fears and doubts that should have accompanied such unexpected news. Instead, he found only certainty, the same bone-deep conviction that had driven every decision since Elena had entered his life. "Like the luckiest man alive," he said simply. "Like everything we've built together was just preparation for this." Elena's tears were happy ones, and Bear kissed them away while marveling at the woman who'd not only saved his life, but continued to expand it in ways he'd never imagined possible. A baby would change everything again, adding new responsibilities and joys to the partnership they'd worked so hard to create. "The house will need work," Elena said practically, already planning. "A nursery, child-proofing, maybe expanding the family room." "Whatever you want," Bear replied, meaning it completely. "Whatever you need." "I want our child to grow up here," Elena continued, her voice dreamy with visions of the future. "To learn about the land and the animals, to understand the value of hard work and family legacy." Bear looked around the kitchen that had become the heart of their home, imagining it filled with the sounds of a growing family. High chairs and toy boxes, homework at the kitchen table, the controlled chaos of raising a child who would inherit not just land and cattle, but the love that had created this unexpected second chance. "Have I mentioned lately that I love you?" Bear asked, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Elena continued to give him. "Only every day," Elena replied, her smile mischievous. "But I don't mind hearing it again." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Bear reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The cancer that had threatened to end his story had instead marked the beginning of his real life. Elena's arrival at his gate, seemingly by chance, had proved to be the most important moment of his 63 years. "What are you thinking about?" Elena asked, her hand resting on the slight curve of her belly that would soon hold their child. "Time," Bear replied honestly. "How much we have, how we want to spend it, what we want to build with it." "And what do you want to build?" Bear looked out over the pastures where their cattle grazed peacefully, where their horses ran free, where the next generation of Coltrans would learn to ride and work and love the land that had shaped his family for generations. "Everything," he said simply. "A family, a legacy, a love story that our grandchildren will tell to their grandchildren." Elena's laugh was bright with possibility. "Grandchildren? You're getting ahead of yourself." "Maybe," Bear admitted. "But for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of the future. I'm excited about it." As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Bear thought about the brand design waiting on the kitchen table, two letters joined together to create something new, something lasting, something that would mark their cattle and their legacy for generations to come. Like their marriage, like their child, like the love they built from nothing, but trust and determination, and the courage to hope for more than either had dared. Dream alone. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times from inside the house, but Bear no longer heard loneliness in its voice. Now it marked time shared, moments treasured, a future filled with possibility. Elena dozed against his shoulder, their unborn child resting safely between them, and Bear felt a contentment so profound it seemed to emanate from the very soil. Beneath their feet, he'd spent years building walls to protect himself from loss, only to discover that the greatest loss was the life he'd never allowed himself to live. Elena had torn down those walls with nothing but love and persistence, showing him that the real risk wasn't in caring too much. It was in caring too little. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to build the future. They'd begun sketching in those first tentative conversations over coffee and ranch planning. Their child would arrive in spring, and with it, a new chapter in the Coltrane family story, one that honored the past while embracing an uncertain but promising future. Bear kissed the top of Ilana's head and settled back to watch the stars wheel overhead, marking time that was no longer just endured, but truly lived. In his pocket, the deed to expand their property waited to be signed. In the kitchen, the brand design waited to be registered. In Elena's body, their child waited to be born. All of it, the land, the love, the legacy stretched ahead of them, like a promise written in starlight and sealed with hope. Barrett Coltrane had finally learned to stop merely surviving and started truly living, and the future had never looked brighter.